The topic for today is going to be the testimony. This is what you see in Isaiah 8:16 and 8:20, where Isaiah writes, "To the law and the testimony, if they speak not according to these words, there's no light or understanding in them." And we're going to see why this is. So let me see if I can now transition through this. Okay, so that now I know how I'm going to have to do this. Okay, so the first thing that we find with the testimony is that it is long and detailed. And this is, we're going to read from Exodus 32. This would have been right after Moses had received the tablets of testimony that were written in his hand. And this is what it says. "And Moses turned and went down from the mountain, and the two tables of the testimony were in his hand. The tables were written on both their sides. On the one side and on the other were they written." So this tells you that this would have been a very detailed document, and there would have been a lot to it. So the next question that we have is, what specifically is the testimony? And we have in Exodus 31, it says, "And Yehovah spoke to Moses, saying, Speak you also to the children of Israel, and saying, My Sabbaths you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout all your generations, that you may know that I am Yehovah your God, that sanctifies you." Now, just as an interjection here, remember that every single covenant had a sign that kind of sealed the covenant as far as its validity. It showed that you were in compliance with the pact. And if you breached that pact, then it meant that you had breached the covenant and you were no longer in compliance with the treaty of that agreement. So continuing on. "Why the children of Israel shall keep my Sabbaths and observe the Sabbath throughout their generations, for it is a perpetual covenant." Now remember, perpetual is something that is eternal. It's not something that Yehovah can rescind. It is eternal. It is in perpetuity. So it's for generation upon generation. "So it is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days Yehovah made the heavens and the earth, and the seventh day he rested and he was refreshed. And he gave to Moses, when he had made an end of communicating with him on the Mount Sinai, 2 tables of testimony, the table of stone written on with the finger of God." So pretty important. The finger of Yehovah himself etched these out in stone and gave them to Moses. Now we find that the 10 Commandments are part of the testimony. And the word commandments is really kind of a mistranslation. A much better translation of mitzvot, oh, I got ahead of myself here, of mitzvot is really the idea that they are 10 categories. So if we say there are 10 categories of law or 10 categories of issues of justice with which the covenant is going to address, that is a better understanding of what the 10 mitzvot or the 10 commandments are. So this is going to be Exodus 34:27. It says, "And Yehovah said to Moses, Write you these words, for after this tenor of the words have I made a covenant with you and with all Israel." And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 commandments. So we find that the words of the covenant and the 10 commandments are on the stone. The 10 commandments define, again, all the categories of the law. So if you were to take the law of Moses and you were to divide it into 10 categories, you would find that every single issue that the law addresses will fit underneath one of these 10 categories, whether it's how we treat our fellow man, whether it is the idea of not committing idolatry. The Shabbat, believe it or not, the Shabbat has much more to do with just resting on one day of the week. It really has everything to do with human rights and guaranteeing that your slaves, that the people in your house are afforded one day off of work per week. Today, there are a lot of religious significance with the day in that the law commands that you have a holy convocation or you get together on that day. But truly, the founding principle behind the Shabbat is simply that you had a day of rest, a day to be refreshed during your week so that you weren't overworked and you really didn't work yourself into the ground. So the covenant forms, or the 10 Commandments form an essential part of the testimony. We also find that the testimony was put into the Ark of the Covenant. So Yehovah says, you shall put the ark of the testimony which I shall give you, and you shall put the mercy seat above the ark. And in the ark you shall put the testimony that I shall give to you. And later on it states, and there I will meet with you, and there I will commune with you from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim which are on the ark of the testimony. Of all things would I give you in commandment to the children of Israel. Now, vision this for a moment. You remember the Ark of the Covenant. There are two cherubim on top, between the ark. I'm going to transition back here for a minute. There's two cherubim, and between the cherubim is the mercy seat. And under the mercy seat, you have the testimony. So what this implies, in Psalms 199, it states that Moses, being a prophet, and Aaron, the priest, and then on the other side, the king, you have this division of power between the king and the priest. And you have this idea that any discussion, whether it is issues of constitution, whether it is issues of judgment, of justice, even issues of national policy, you find that all of those discussions are going to be based on the foundational document that resides between them, which is the testimony. So this testimony becomes very, very important to any discussion that we have in Israel, whether it is one of law and jurisprudence or whether it is one of prophecy, as we will see today. So I'm going to go transition back. So the testimony really determines all course of discussion, whether it is government or religious in throughout Israel's history. So the thing that we're going to be looking at today, the aspect of the testimony, are the parts of the testimony that define the consequence for breach of pact. This is really where you find a lot of prophecy. And it's not just, here's a prophecy, here's what's going to happen. What we are going to see is that this prophecy was a chronological law. In other words, it was a law that defined all prophecy for all time, for anything that had to do with Israel, and by extension, really anything that had to do with the world. So if another prophet, if another source comes and contradicts this chronological prophecy in the Torah, as Isaiah says, there is no light in them. So this is what it says in Deuteronomy 31:24. It says, and it came to pass when Moses had made an end of writing the words of this law in a book until they were finished, that Moses commanded the Levites, which bear the ark of the covenant of Yehovah, saying, take this book of the law and put it in the side of the ark of the covenant of Yehovah your God, that it may be there for a witness against you. Now, if you'll notice, I've highlighted and read this idea that the testimony witnesses against Israel. So how does a document witness against people? Well, you find that Yehovah was very specific in the curses that are on the law. And he says, if you do this, then this will happen. So then let's look at this in reverse. If we see a particular curse from the law that is being evidenced in ancient Israel's society or even in society today, then we can probably reason that the reason that curse has occurred is because we have breached a particular law or injunction and teaching and instruction within the Torah. And then that is why that particular curse has occurred. For instance, the curse of diaspora, because Israel rebelled against Yehovah. That is still witnessed today. One of the curses of the law is that there would be blight, there would be disease, there would be parasites on our crops. Even famine is another curse of the law. So if we see those curses being carried out and being active in our society today, then it demonstrates that that particular society has indeed breached the curses of the law. Now, I also want to point out that even though there are specific curses of the law, the entire Torah embraces natural law. So what does that mean? What it means is that Yehovah, if you read Proverbs chapter 8, Yehovah founded our entire world based on the laws of physics, based on the laws of govern our universe. And really all that the Torah does is it captures these laws. It takes these laws and it puts it into a legal code and as into a way of life that teaches us how to live so that we are in harmony with nature, so that we are in harmony with the very rules and laws and methods by which Yehovah created our universe. So again, the curses of the law, if those are being carried out, it is a witness against Israel that they have breached Yehovah's pact. So now we're going to look at the stipulations. And welcome to all you guys who have joined. I'm so glad you are with us. And I hope you'll continue to join us as we go through the testimony in the weeks ahead. So stipulations. While the Ten Commandments were the stipulations of Israel's covenant in Exodus 20, the blessings and curses formed a chronological law that all prophecies followed. They were based on Leviticus 26. It is this formal covenant treaty that forms the nation's formal testimony. So Leviticus 26 was the very first testimony given to Israel at Mount Sinai. This would have been given to Israel when they first came out of the Promised Land. It would have been given to Israel when they had only rebelled a few times. This was very early on. This was before the spies had brought back a negative report. And what you find in Leviticus 26 is that the testimony is very broad. There's not a lot of specific instructions or specific description as to what is going to occur in each particular epoch of Israel's history. But as we're going to see, Deuteronomy 28 totally changes that and really fills in a lot of details. The testimony, and this is a very important part, the testimony in both Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 incorporated every single patriarchal covenant. Now, if you'll remember in chapter 3, we went through all the patriarchal covenants. There were 4 patriarchal covenants for Abraham, there were 2 for Isaac, and then there were another 4 for Jacob. And each of these covenants, whether it's the migration covenant for Abraham, the promised land covenant, the burnt offering covenant, each of these covenants promised very specific things to Abraham's descendants. The covenants with Jacob. Yehovah actually makes a covenant with Jacob in Genesis, I think it's 28-29, where Yehovah states, I will take your children and I will spread them to the east, to the west, to the north, and the south. And in them I will be blessed. But then he doesn't leave it there. He says, not only will I be blessed through them, or the world will be blessed through them, but he says, but I will not leave you until I bring you back to this land and have performed all the things, all the prophecies and all the promises that I have made with you and your descendants. So you find that all of these aspects of the patriarchal covenants are totally incorporated into both Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. So we don't really think of the prophecies of Genesis having prophetic implications, but they really do. Even the Noahic covenant, as we will see, has prophetic implications, not just for the children of Israel, but for the world at large. All right, so we're going to go on to the next one here. Parts of the law that define prophecy. This is going to be the next section we are going to look at. And this is really a breakdown of the abridged testimonial law. You find that each and every book of the Torah gives you some aspect of prophecy that foretells Israel's future. In Exodus is the tabernacle of testimony, where the items, this would be perhaps, a little bit more of a mystical interpretation with the tabernacle of testimony. But you find that what happens is that Exodus defines very clear and very concrete symbolism for what the different items in the tabernacle represent. For instance, bread ends up representing the word of Yehovah. Wine ends up depicting doctrine. And it isn't just doctrine that wine depicts, it's really false doctrine, because if you think of it, wine makes you inebriated, it takes you away from reality, and it can make you very drunk. So if you're drunk, you're not in your right mind, you're not functioning at your full capacity, and you're really coming up with things that are quite absurd at times. So you find that there's a lot of ideas that are established in the Tabernacle of Testimony, one of them being the molten sea, where you have this idea of 2,000 baths or 3,000 baths based on the interpretation in Chronicles and Kings of Israel being cleansed. You see Hosea later building off this idea that Israel will be in diaspora for 2,000 years, and in the third day Yehovah will raise them up. So a lot of these ideas are really defined. They are incorporated into the Tabernacle of Testimony. And again, all the prophets from Isaiah, Jeremiah, they borrow from the symbolism. So when you see the prophets using phrases and idioms, to really understand them, you have to go back to the tabernacle, go back to Exodus, and see how they are defined and how they're developed through Psalms and Proverbs. Psalms and Proverbs are really the first books that will associate a particular item, whether it's wine, bread, the showbread, or something like that, where it will define that item with a particular concept. So again, Psalms and Proverbs are great at understanding the symbolism. The next that we have is Leviticus 26, which defines the 7 times. Now, the 7 times are 70-year epics. So you find that in Israel's history, these 70 years occur over and over again. And in each 70-year epic, Israel is given a chance, an opportunity to turn from her sins and to avert the next 70 years of curses. It's very fascinating, when Isaiah in Isaiah 7 says 65 years until Ephraim is not a people. You find that he's 5 years into that 70-year time period. Again, Jeremiah, he says, 70 years are determined upon Jerusalem to be without inhabitant. And then I will say to Jerusalem, be restored, and it will be rebuilt. So what you find is that there's a 70-year period between, if you take the destruction of the first temple in 587 BCE and you go forward 70 years, guess what? The second temple was rebuilt and dedicated exactly 70 years after the destruction of the first temple. So you find that scripture is actually very, very precise in not only its use of the 7 times, but also in the fulfillment of prophecy. I'm actually working on a chronology for ancient Israel, and it is amazing how incredibly correct it is. It corresponds exactly to the Assyrian chronology. Assyria used what was called an eponym list, where the years of each of her kings are given with the governors of other land within the administration. And you find that that chronology totally corresponds to the chronology that is established in Kings and Chronicles, mainly the book of Kings, for Israel's monarchs. Okay, so the next one is going to be Deuteronomy, where you have the blessings and the curses. And that is where you have the blessings occur until in the very first part during the time of David. Then you have a time of curses that occurs with the dividing of the kingdom. And these curses last for a very, very long time until Deuteronomy 29, verse 22, when you find there's this new generation. There's this generation that is awakening to the history of its forefathers, and it's awakening to remembering these ancient law codes and returning to Yehovah. Then you find that you have the prophecies where Israel will return and Israel will follow Yehovah once more. Then the last part is going to be Numbers. First of all, you have Numbers 5, whereas there's this curse of bitter waters that goes across the land. That's one of them. But then you find in Numbers this latter-day blessing, the ultimate blessing that is really Balaam's blessing in Numbers 23 and 24, where it states, there is no device that can be formed against Jacob. I have said he is going to be blessed. Behold, he'll be blessed. And it's not just a blessing, but it's a double blessing. And the irony in this is that Israel receives this blessing from Yehovah but they receive it through a pagan prophet. And even though as a pagan prophet, Yehovah is not daunted by it, it is still upheld by all of Israel's prophets. So this is the abridged testimonial law. And if you will notice, I did mention Numbers 5, which is not here. So then I really stress in a lot of the teachings that I do that Israel's ancient authors, whether we look at Moses, Joshua, whether we look at Isaiah, David, every single prophet really was more of a scholar than what they were, someone who just had this magic, like Balaam, where they could just magically see into the future. They were in a trance or something like that. Well, you find the vast majority of scripture is the same type of scholarship that academia performs today, where we take the words of one scholar. Once the theory that whatever is being presented is shown to work, once it's shown to be right and true, well, then we build on that and we keep expounding our knowledge, and it keeps growing and developing. So you find that this is the concept that you find in Isaiah 8:20, where it says, to the law and the testimony, if they don't speak in accord with this, it is because there's no light in them. So you find that the law of Moses and the testimony really provide this bedrock. And I also want you to notice that Isaiah does separate the idea of the law of Moses and the testimony. The testimony would have been the 10 Commandments. It would have been the curses and blessings of Leviticus 26. That's what the original testimony would have contained. So this is just a very important concept, because if any prophet does not follow the chronology of the testimony, or if their doctrine goes against the words of the testimony, well, then they're not speaking truth. It's a good way to test any preacher, teacher, or what have you, to see if their words ring true. All right, so I call this part, we're going to look at the curses of the law. And this is really God's 10-point plan of salvation. You see lots of self-help today have, a 10-point personal improvement plan. Well, this is Yehovah's personal improvement plan for the nation of Israel. And not just for the nation of Israel, it really flows into the rest of the world. So let me see if I can, okay, there it goes. So how do the curses of the law work, and how are they effective? And how did the prophets understand them to work in ancient times? So what you find, and I am showing here the parallel laws. And this is where we're going to get into some of the homework that I'm giving you guys over the next 2 weeks. During the week, either take this video, or if you have Yahweh Exists, go back to around page 700. It's 701, I think 700 to 703 in the book. But go back to these pages and don't just read the outline that I have in the book, but get your scriptures out and read these verses for yourself in the Torah. Compare what they say. Now, I will say that sometimes the translations are not really good at showing the Hebrew and showing that the exact same terminology is being used in both Deuteronomy and Leviticus. But if you have a Bible program, or you can read the Hebrew, then use that. Or if you have an interlinear, that's even better. Get your interlinear, look at the Hebrew that's used in these corresponding verses, and you will see that they say the exact same thing. So with this particular designation of the law, of the testimony, you find that all Yehovah does in this part is just put like a preamble. This outlines what will happen if they break covenant. It's a very generalized synopsis of, if you do this, this is ultimately what will happen. So there is no chronological designation with this first part, because again, it is preamble to the actual contract that is then going to stipulate Israel consequences for Israel's breach of pact. All right, so the first part that we have is an epic of blessing. You find this occurs in Deuteronomy 26 verses 1 through 13 and Deuteronomy 28 verses 1 through 14. If you will compare these texts, you will find that they say the exact same thing. Leviticus 26 is not near as wordy as Deuteronomy 28. Again, Deuteronomy 28 is a lot more color, a lot more shading, and a lot more criteria between the lines as far as what will constitute that blessing. So this particular part of the testimony does indeed have a chronological designation. And we can assign this chronologically to the time of Saul, David, Samuel, and Solomon. So this lasted for a little bit less than 100 years. Right at 70 years, you find Israel had a blessing. And the ultimate height of this blessing, the ultimate evidence of this blessing, was Yehovah setting his tabernacle among the Israelites. In the monarch, previously in the Judges era, it was Yehovah establishing a tabernacle, and then during the monarchy, it was Yehovah establishing his temple. Now, what is the importance of a temple? You know, the temple itself, there's a lot of superstition attached to it, but the most significant issue or fact with the temple is that it indicated national independence. The ability to have a temple, to maintain it, really spoke of Israel's righteousness, to have that structure where you find as they become more wicked, they depart from righteousness, the temple becomes kind of picked apart. And it really represents the people of Israel, because when the temple gets picked apart, so do the people. The people get plucked off the land. You find that they have to give their income as tribute to foreign nations. And really what happens to the temple happens to Israel. So the temple represents the children of Israel and their ability to live righteously. So that's really the importance of the temple. It also represents the closeness. If you remember Deuteronomy 4, verses 4 through 8, it's symbolic of having Yehovah very close and very near among Israel, and having Yehovah's righteous statutes governing the land and Israel walking in them. All right, so the era of blessing is the first that we find in Israel's history. And let me just come back real quick, actually, to the date of 944. The reason 944 is important is because that is the date of the dichotomy. This is where the tribes depart from Judah, and 10 tribes are given to Jeroboam. And this, you find that when Israel splits in two is when we find the very first curses begin to fall upon the nation of Israel. And these very first curses are really benign. You find that verses Deuteronomy 28, 15 through 21 simply outline and define the curses, and it divides the curses into 5 parts. So there will be 5 periods of 70 years. You find that Deuteronomy maintains this 5-part division, and more accurately, or more with greater fidelity, you find Leviticus 26 maintains this 5-part division. And for some reason, the text did not show up for Leviticus 26, but it is in the book. It's in chapter 14 of Yehovah Exists, if you want to verify that text. Okay, so this is what the stipulations are for the very first time the curses fall upon Israel. Now, this would have been dated from the moment that the kingdoms depart in 944, and it would have extended 70 years all the way down to 874. And this is what Leviticus states. But if you will not listen to me, and will do all these commandments, and if you shall despise my statutes, or if your soul will abhor my judgments, so that you do not do all my commandments, but that you break my covenant, I will also do this to you. So you find this is a preamble. This again defines the stipulation. And then you're going to find in verse 17, Yehovah starts defining exactly what it is that he is going to do to the children of Israel as consequence for their breach of pact. So Deuteronomy 28, 15 through 20, just notice the very similar speech and the very kind of parallel passages that are given. It says, "But it shall come to pass, if you will not listen to the voice of Yehovah your God, to observe all his commandments and his statutes, which I command you this day, that all the curses shall come upon you and overtake you. Cursed will you be in the city, and cursed will you be in the field. Cursed will you be in the basket and in your store. Cursed will you be in the fruit of your body and the fruit of the land, the increase of your cows, the flocks of your sheep. Cursed shall you be when you come in and when you go out." That refers to war. Coming in and going out is always a military term. Even in Assyrian records, you find the same terminology. It says, "And cursed will you be when you go out. And Yehovah will send on you the cursing, vexation, rebuke in all that you set your hand to do, until you be destroyed and until you perish quickly because of the wickedness of your doings, whereby you have forsaken me." So as you can tell, Deuteronomy again defines and gives a greater parameters as well as more definite structure to the nature of the curses that are mentioned in Leviticus 26:14 through 16. Okay, so this is the start of the curses. Their curses in the field and curses in the fruit of the body begin. Now, I am not going to give the text to you for you to go through today, simply because we would probably be here for about 3 hours. And I am wanting to not go over too far with class. We are about halfway through the class today, so I'm wanting to keep within the parameters. But what I am, again, this is your homework this week. Please look these texts up in your scriptures this week and compare them. So don't just take my word for it, but compare the words that are spoken and see if it matches up with Israel's history. And again, I do discuss all of this information, and I go through all the words of the prophets that support it in chapter 14. So the first curses occur between the reigns of Jeroboam and Ahab, and then for Judah between Rehoboam and Jehoshaphat. So this is the very first period of curses. Now, what's interesting is that the first period of curses are not where we find the famine. You just find that you begin to have blight, you begin to have not just blight, but also parasites that begin to attack the land, as well as people begin to get sick. They begin to run fevers for the first time in Israel's history. So this is the first time where we see that Israel's health and the health of her descendants begins to decline. Diseases enter into Israel's society, diseases that had not existed previously. So the second 70-year epoch occurs from 874 to 804. You find that these are rebuke, pestilence, famine. And this is fascinating because when you read these verses, Deuteronomy 28:23 through 24 and Leviticus 26:18 through 20, it's almost as though you are reading the exact same verse in both testimonies. Your heaven will be as brass, or your heaven is bronze, and your earth is iron. The earth will not yield its fruit. It talks about an incredible, terrible famine. Well, this just so happens to totally parallel the time that Elijah came before Ahab, and he says, "There will be neither dew nor rain for 3 years until I say so." So how did Elijah know to prophesy that? How did he know to predict that particular event? Well, as Isaiah said, Elijah looked to the law, he looked to the testimony. He knew they were in that second 7-time period, actually at the very beginning of that second time period. And he knew that famine was the already predetermined decree, because Yehovah had already set this decree up at Sinai and reiterated it again in the plains of Moab shortly before Israel entered the promised land in Deuteronomy. So you find that Elijah simply looked to the law, and he knew God's heart. He knew what God had in store for Israel if they would continue to be disobedient into this time period. Now, when we talk about the temple's structure of the temple being prophetic, you also find that the temple's 12 cubic fillet, which represented Boaz and Jachin pillars, entered into the monarchy. This would have been the house of Omri, which was a sanctuared house. It was something that was proscribed, something that was cursed in Israel's history. But you find that Omri's house enters into the house of David, which was a sure house, during the reign of Jehoram. And it enters into David's house through a wicked queen by the name of Athaliah. And this becomes very important because this is an aspect of Israel's history that is depicted in the temple that Solomon built. Now you may remember in Second Chronicles, it states that David had this pattern of the temple. He understood the pattern of the temple by the hand of Yehovah's Spirit when he delivered it unto Solomon. So it accurately predicted, it accurately prophesied of the events to occur in Israel's history, even down to what would happen with David's descendants. So that's pretty incredible. So this again parallels Leviticus 26:18 through 20, where the second times of the testimony are fulfilled. And again, these are 70-year epics. So now we're going to be looking at the third year. And here, what you find is that this epic begins. God, we're into the third epic now, and now he's really going to tell you what is going to happen to you. There have been 140 years that have occurred under the curses. You have not yet returned to Yehovah. You have not yet repented. So now he's laying it on the line. There are a lot of things that are going to affect you and your descendants. So you find wild beasts are multiplied. Wild beasts in scripture almost always depict foreign invading armies. In Yahweh Exist, I have a lot of pages where we go through the scripture and we chart a lot of text where scripture uses wild beast as symbolisms for foreign armies. And it's interesting. They're never local armies like from Syria, Edom, Damascus, Phoenicia. They're never local. They're always foreign, whether it's Egypt, Assyria, or Babylon. Wild beasts are always something that is further away from Israel's borders. You also find that Israel loses population. And you will find that every single time the law states, the testimony states, you will be bereaved of your children will, you will long for your children, but they will be not. Anytime you see this reference to a loss of children, it is actually a prophecy that depicts an invasion and deportation of Israel. Now, what is fascinating with this is that scripture does not actually preserve all of the deportations. There's about 2 or 3 deportations that we have no record of in scripture. So the question is, did it really happen? Was scripture even accurate? But what's fascinating is that with the discovery of Nineveh in 1850 by Henry Layard and the early excavations, we discover from both Tiglath-Pilesser's inscriptions and Sargon and Sennacherib's inscriptions, we find that some of the deportations that are not mentioned in scripture are preserved on the walls of their palaces over in ancient Assyria, modern day Iraq. So it's very, very fascinating when you chart these. And in a minute, you're going to see I actually have a chart where we go through some of these. Every single time the testimony refers to a loss of children, a loss of population, or that you will go into captivity, every single reference, and there are 8 of them, refer to a real live invasion and deportation of the nation of Israel. So that is just something that when I was studying this, I was just awestruck with the incredible fidelity of the testimony and how even down to the detail we can evidence that in history. So you find that the kings of Samaria during this time period went from Jehoash all the way to Pekah. We also have an inscription by Adad-Nirari of Syria who states that he received tribute in his 5th year from Jehoash. So we can see the curses being placed on Israel. For Judah, this would have been Amaziah to Jotham. Now, let me just make this point real quick. I'm going to grab a swig of water here, just a second. You find that for Judah, the curses of the law don't fall as stringently or as tough on them in these beginning periods, the first 3 epics of Israel's history, because as the prophets say, Israel departed from Yehovah. They continued to follow the ways of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. Never once in all of Samaria's history, Ephraim's history, the northern kingdom. Do its kings or its people really have this period of renaissance, of reformation, where they turn from their evil ways to return back to the covenant, the law, or Yehovah in any way? Rather, you find that it just continues this perpetual slide into oppression and into a way of life that is very destructive. And it really becomes very destructive with Menahem, who goes in and begins to kill his own people. And any city that opposed him, he would go in and just really annihilate and genocide of the whole community. So you find that Judah, the curses are a little bit slower to fall on Judah, because they had, even though they would depart from Yehovah, they would come back. So you find this issue, this pattern of depart and come back, to Shuvah, depart and come back. So Yehovah still kept them in his good graces because of the fact that they were still walking in his ways. Did not exempt them from all of the curses of the law, but they were not affected by the first deportations that occurred to the northern kingdom. However, as we will see, the deportations for Judah are certainly mentioned and prophesied of in the testimony. So the continuation now of the third curse. Now, within the third epic, or the third 7 times period of the law, of the testimony, you find that it refers to something that is very specific. It is the curse at noonday. And this is a judgment against knowledge. This occurs Isaiah's first year, and this is the mission that was given to Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6. And if you will recall, Isaiah states, I saw Yehovah high and lifted up, his glory filled the temple, and it talks about his train. And, an angel says, who will come, who will go for us? And Isaiah says, here am I, send me. And he removes the sin or the uncleanliness from Isaiah's lips. And he says, go make the heart of this people heavy. Make their ears heavy that they cannot hear, and their eyes blind so that they cannot see. So you find, when you realize that the mission given to Isaiah very early in his prophetic career for Israel, that his whole entire mission was to blind Israel and to make her deaf, then you have to really kind of approach the book of Isaiah with a little bit of respect, and not assume that it is going to be completely straightforward. You're going to have to use a lot of discernment, and you're going to have to use a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? Pause and carefulness when you read through Isaiah's book, because he has a mission there. This was an act of judgment against ancient Israel, and it really constituted the first day of darkness. One of the things that Yehovah states that he would do, this is in Exodus 23:16, I believe. I think that's the text. Yehovah states, I will take all the diseases, all the plagues of Egypt, and I will place them on you if you do not obey the words of my covenant. So you find that Israel will live under this curse of darkness for 3 days, the same way that the ancient Egyptians also were under 3 days of darkness. And really this idea that the sun goes down at noonday, it occurs in 745 BCE. We can date this very, very solidly because of the fact that Isaiah gives us, he dates his prophecy in accordance with events that have happened within Hezekiah's life and Uzziah's life. And you find that those kings, those monarchs also gave us very solid dates with their reigns. So that is why this can be very firmly dated. But again, the curse at New Day was the darkening of truth. It was the darkening of knowledge, so that you could no longer read it in a straightforward manner. And what Isaiah does is, you will see that these curses of the law, these 3 days that we have seen, these 3 70-year time periods, Isaiah begins to mix them up in his testimony. He doesn't use, you cannot read the book of Isaiah and assume that it is chronological in any sense of the word, because it is not. What Isaiah writes is true and accurate, but he uses the phrase in that day or in this day to distinguish the time period to which he is referring. So you have to, the only way that you can decipher the book of Isaiah is to take what Isaiah says and to compare it to the testimony of Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. And then you can say, oh, this is the time period to which Isaiah is referring, and then it gives you some sort of context. All right, so that is the curse at noonday. The third epic ends, and remember, God gave a lot of description here, a lot of detail for this third epic. We find that Israel is so evil, the land fails for justice. There's a second deportation. The northern kingdom is given no more deliverers. So this, the kings of Samaria are Pekah and Hosea. For Judah, they're Ahaz and Hezekiah, and the third time ends. This is again where Yehovah says, and I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. Every time you hear that, it is a new 7 times or new era of 70 years. The fourth 7 times begins in 734 BCE. The curse is on the northern kingdom, which is deported along with her king. It is the third deportation. You have here the prophecy of Hosea. The prophecy of Jezreel is fulfilled. And what we also find is that Judah is becoming more and more wicked. So at the same time, the northern kingdom is deported. During its third deportation is the first deportation of Judah. And this deportation was not a small one. Sennacherib tells us that from the districts around Jerusalem, such as Lachish, Beersheba, and some of these other sites that surrounded Jerusalem, he deported 250,000 Jews. So this was a massive deportation. And, they were taken to Assyria. They were taken from their homeland. So what you find is that Yehovah has already cut the northern kingdom short 3 times. And now he's beginning to cut the southern kingdom short as well. And remember as well that Yehovah's covenant, his contract with Israel, was always based on Israel being on the land. Israel really had no autonomy. They had no strength or power to establish his covenant in other lands. It was solely for the land of Israel. So as Israel is taken off the land, that covenant is being broken for Israel's own sins because they no longer have the power or the protection or the independence to live under that constitution that ensured Israel's rights and her freedom. All right, the fourth epic of 7 times ends in 664 BCE. This is Deuteronomy 28 through 30. This still corresponds with Leviticus 26:26. You have the deportation of Ephraim, and this fulfills Isaiah 7:8, where Isaiah says 65 years until Ephraim be not a people. It also fulfills the Hosea's prophecy of Lo Rema, where I will utterly take them away. And this is also spills over into Judah one more time, where Manasseh is deported. Now, the story of Manasseh's deportation is one that is very curious because it states that Manasseh was the worst king in Judah's history. His sins were so great. He was the Stalin and the Hitler of Judah. Anybody who disagreed with him was annihilated without question. And you find that his sins were so bad that Yehovah states that he would no longer pardon Judah's sins. He would no longer grant Judah mercy because the sins of Manasseh, which caused Israel to sin. So Manasseh is taken to Assyria. He is put in Assyria for an undefined period of time based on the testimony, based on the prophetic law. We can reconstruct Manasseh's deportation to about 7 years. But what's interesting is that Sennacherib had a very curious way of dealing with rebellious kings. And one of the ways, there was this one particular Arab king where he put a bear collar around him. made him be absolutely naked, no clothes on, and put him on the city wall. And he gave him a phrase to say back and forth as he walked along this wall day after day. And after a little while of doing this, the king decided that it was better to swear allegiance to King Sennacherib and to no longer rebel than it was to keep up this humiliating act. So if Sennacherib had done something similar with Manasseh, then where scripture says that Manasseh became greatly humbled before Sennacherib and before Yehovah, we might be able to appreciate how and why that process occurred. So for Samaria, this occurs well into the time where there's no more kings. For Judah's kings, this goes through Hezekiah through Manasseh. Now the fifth 7 times begins. This is the last 7 times in the first temple period. You find the measuring line of Samaria is stretched over Jerusalem. This would have been this epic of 70 years is stretched over Jerusalem. All the curses of the law fall on Jacob. He becomes the tail. He's no longer the head. There's tribute to Pharaoh Necho. You also find that one of the reasons that the curses fall on Judah is because they're the only ones left in the land. If they become righteous, if they sanctify the covenant, they sanctify Yehovah, then the curses will not continue on. But as you read through the story, the testimonies of Jeremiah, of the prophets, you find a very clear picture that Israel does not repent during this time. In fact, when you read Jeremiah 34, you find that Jeremiah in the very last release year, and remember release years came every 7 years, and every 7 years you were supposed to release your Hebrew slaves. Well, what you find is that during this 7th year release year that occurred during Zedekiah's 5th year, you find that Jeremiah gathers together all the nobles, all the princes, everyone in Judah, and he tries to have them recovenant with Yehovah, something that Deuteronomy 31 commands Israel to do every 7 years. So he gathers them together. He tries to have them enter into a covenant with Yehovah, which they do. And they swear that they will let their Hebrew slaves go free. They will uphold the covenant. They will give them their liberty. And Jeremiah is doing this because he knows if Israel will do righteously, if they will return to the covenant, then they can avoid national disaster. So as you read through Jeremiah 34, 35, you find that Zedekiah and the nobles, they make this covenant. They release their Hebrew slaves. But it isn't but a month or 2 later, perhaps. It doesn't give us an exact time period. And these nobles are going, we've just lost our labor force. We can't compete. We need our workers back. So what happens? They go out and they bring into oppression once again. They capture all the slaves they had allowed to go free, and they bring them into subjection again. So they fail to recovenant with Yehovah. They fail to do teshuvah, and the very oppression that they put on their fellow Hebrews, now they are going to find themselves under as they are deported off the land. So the beginning of this 5th 7 times begins with Manasseh, Josiah, and Jehoahaz, and Jehoiakim. And you will also find that there are very specific times of deportation that are referred to in this portion of the testimony. The 5th 7th time continues, and what you'll notice, and this is fascinating as you see the parallel between the testimony and the number of Israel's prophets. Very early in Israel's rebellion, during the 1st and 2nd epochs of Israel's history, you find very few prophets being sent to Israel. The first are Micah and Amos, and they're very short books, and there really are not a lot of prophets. But as Israel's sins increase, as Israel's rebellion increases and the depravity of her sins, you find the number of her prophets increase. You also find the depiction within the testimony greatly increases as well. More and more information is given, more and more attributes and facts of Israel's deportation are depicted and covered within the testimony. So this is just kind of symptomatic of the greater the sins, the more watchmen Israel is given. So you find Israel is given to foreign tribute. The second deportations of Judah occur under Jehoiakim. This would have been Babylon's first deportation of Judah. You also find that the Moabites, Syrians, Chaldees, Ammonites begin to deport Judah as well. This would have been from Jehoahaz all the way down to Zedekiah. So it just simply continues the previous 7 times. Now you find that beginning in Deuteronomy 28, 52 through 57, as well as Leviticus 29 through 31, it predicts the fall of Jerusalem. It talks about being utterly deported, utterly taken away. Judah's third and fourth deportations occur at this time. And then this statement that the tabernacle or the temple that I set among you will be destroyed, and you will be, no more people before me. So if you look at the words, again, I encourage you to look at the wordings of the 2 testimonies, both the testimony at Sinai and the testimony from Deuteronomy, which occurred about a month before Israel entered the promised land. Compare those. They have incredible fidelity, and they really say the exact same thing. Now, the other thing that you find is that there was a judgment that Yehovah had made against Israel. It began with a stipulation in Numbers 33. In chapter 12, I termed them the 5 Ds, where Israel is told to destroy the high places, destroy the images, to drive out the people of Canaan, and to divide their land as an inheritance. They're told to do this so they can have national peace, so that they can be at rest and they don't have to worry about insurgency within their own homeland. Israel never does this, and because of this, they are always plagued by these natives that become thorns in their sides, and they're always a sense of nuisance. They lead Israel astray. And Yehovah states as the judgment for this in Numbers 33:46, he says, "Behold, what I thought to do to them, I will do to you." So you find that for the first temple period, this fulfills that prophecy. It fulfills it in 587 BCE when Judah falls. God breaks his covenant not only with Israel in 587, he breaks his covenant with Judah. They are taken off the land. The temple is destroyed, and they are no more a people before him at this point in time. So now we find that in Deuteronomy 28, verses 58 through 62, it gives a very generalized overview of the curses that are going to plague and be attached to Israel's descendants. These are prophecies of the afflictions that are going to occur during the diaspora. You have diseases of long continuance like cancer, heart disease, arthritis, you could any disease that is sore or long continuance, whether it's Parkinson's. I mean, the list really goes on and on. You also find that there's this idea of uncertainty of life, where you will, at the sound of a shaking leaf, you will think, that your enemies are going to pounce upon you. And if you look at the history of the Jews in particular, you can see where their lives throughout history, at least for a good 1,000 years, each generation lives with uncertainty of life, depending on a particular ruler, whether they're going to chase them out of Europe, whether they are going to slaughter them in Europe, or what have you. You also have the Christian Inquisition, which affected not just Jacob's seed in Judah, but also Jacob's seed in Christianity, where you have Christians that are slaughtered by the Catholic Church, should they hold any opinion that is contrary to the church. Their children are slaughtered, and they are put to death during this period as well. And let me just point out, in the chapter on the day of Yehovah, I go into great detail showing that there are 2 prophecies. One of them that talks about 1 in 10 people out of Jerusalem being saved, and the other 9/10 being given to the slaughter. You also have the prophecy in Ezekiel as well as the law and Isaiah that talks about 1 and 3 being saved, and what Yehovah would do with the 2/3 versus what he would do with that 1/3. And it is that 1/3 where Yehovah says, I will bring them as gold through the fire, and I will make a man more precious than gold. So all of these curses, really the purpose of them is to refine Israel's heart, to refine Israel so that she no longer desires to do wickedly, so that she desires to do righteously. And it's the process, a very long process of writing the law on our hearts. And it's really written there, almost put in our DNA. It's encoded within us by the incredible oppression, by the incredible heartache, and the incredible wars and afflictions that our forefathers have endured and they have suffered. It's almost as though we inherit this knowledge and this respect for oppression and seeing why and how it does not work. So these right here are the deportations of Israel and Judah. I do have this chart in my book. And as you can see, there are 4 deportations of Israel, and there are 4 deportations of Judah. So when you go through the testimony, and just take this chart and line it up with Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26, and see every single time Deuteronomy refers to a deportation, it is noted here in on this chart. Now, I will say, I'm looking at this chart, I did not put the Deuteronomy text. I think this chart would actually be better if I had that on there. So if I ever do a second reprint of this book, I will be sure to add the Deuteronomy text on here. So that way you have a very firm frame of reference and a greater context where the testimony is concerned. But anyways, you can still take this. It's a little bit extra homework for you. Compare it to the testimony, and note that every time, again, it's every time the testimony states that you will be bereaved of your children, or you will long after your children and they will be no more, or you will go into captivity. Each of those type of references is prophesying of one of these 8 deportations that occurred in Israel and Judah. So now we come to the 6th period of 7th times. The 5 7 times of curses have been fulfilled. So there's really no curses at this point in time, but rather there's this rest period. There's this intermission where the land enjoys its Sabbaths. And this is why, how did Jeremiah know that there was 70 years that would be put upon Judah and Jerusalem for the land to enjoy its Sabbath before the remnant under Zerubbabel, Yehoshua, and Ezra and Nehemiah? How did Jeremiah know that 70 years was the time allotted? You even have Daniel, who says in Daniel 9, 70 years are determined upon the people. And we're going to look at that here in just a moment. But how do all these prophets understand this recurring theme of 70 times? Well, they follow what was very well known among Israel's prophets during the day. Even though all the other false prophets and the populace of Israel had really fallen under this dark curse of noonday, they still looked to the testimony. They looked to Leviticus 26, they looked to Deuteronomy 28, and they understood that 70 years was the time that was allotted because they understood the periods of 7 times. All right, so again, you find more depictions given of what's going to occur during the diaspora. Israel is left to her own unrighteousness. She continues to live in her forefathers' iniquities. There's uncertainty of life. And then you begin to find these prophecies of a coming world judgment where the Noahic covenant, this idea where each man will raise his hand against his brother. Israel goes back to the house of bondage. Deuteronomy 28 verse 68 is fulfilled as Israel has 0 independence. She is at the mercy of a foreign king and a foreign monarchy, and whatever rights she has are only by the good graces of that foreign king. Now we enter into the second temple period. Now let me just reiterate. The curses of Leviticus 26, specifically Leviticus 26, I call them cultic judgment against the sanctuary, because you find that Deuteronomy repeats itself 3 times in Israel's history. The first time the curses occur is during the Judges period, and the exact same type of curses that we find in Israel's history without the deportation, because Leviticus does not state deportation until the very end. But you find that Leviticus 26, when that cultic judgment was fulfilled against the sanctuary in the Judges area, the tabernacle was destroyed and the ark was captured by the Philistines. Then you have the second time that is applied on Judah and Jerusalem was during the monarchy period, when there was the first temple. The third time that Leviticus 26 is applied to Israel, and this is really Israel's third chance. God gives the nation of Israel 3 times and 3 different eras and 3 different types of government, types of society, to repent and return to him before he finally casts Israel off. So what you find is that for the third time period, the entire 7 times in Deuteronomy is reset again. So we're going to begin again. Deuteronomy is really going to begin again with all the curses of the law. And during the first temple period, those 7 times, 5 times 7, there were 5 time periods at 70 years apiece. That's 350 years. Same thing during the Judges period. There were 350 years of curses. So now as we go into the second temple period, we're going to find that this 350 years of curses occurs once again. So this parallels the time of David, where there is a blessing, there is a renewal of the covenant, the temple is rebuilt, and you find here the blessings of Haggai, you find the blessings of Zechariah, the blessings of Malachi and Joel. You find all of these prophets talk about the time of blessing that Yehovah is giving to the remnant at this particular time. Now, what's very important here is that Daniel 9:24 stipulates in very clear terms that even though the remnant are restored to the land, even though they are on the land, they only have 70 years, 70 weeks of years, as Daniel states, to end their transgression, to sanctify Yehovah, to return to his covenant. I mean, Yehovah has given them 3 different 350-year time periods to return to him. This is the 3rd era in Israel's history. So he's restoring them to the land again. And in 517, the clock starts ticking. Israel has 70 years to sanctify Yehovah, to turn from their wickedness, and to get it right. After that, if Israel, or rather Judah, in this point in time does not do it, then you find that they have really set their course. They have sealed their fate as far as the coming destruction, the coming day of Yehovah that is in their future. You find that Deuteronomy 29 verses 16 through 17 recognizes the diaspora. The covenant is reactivated. Israel has fulfilled the curse of worshiping new gods in their new homelands, as well as on Yehovah's promised land. So you find that during the second temple period, as they rebel against Yehovah's covenant, they are once again deported off the land. In the book, in chapter 15 and chapter 16, I go through some very fragmented the history that we have from Egypt, where you find both Egypt under the Ptolemies as well as Syria under the Seleucids begins to invade and deport Judah off of the promised land. And this happens again, just like it did in the nation's first 350-year time period, the 5 periods of 7 times, because Judah rebels against the covenant, and Yehovah cuts them short once more. So now we enter the era of world judgment. The 350 years, the 5 periods of 7 times for the second temple era has come to a close, and the day of judgment has occurred. You find that the second temple becomes destroyed. There is civil war. The penalty for Noah's covenant is applied. Israel is cast into the molten sea of 2,000 baths. And then you find that the seventh seven time is completed. And it's kind of interesting the way this works in Leviticus 26 because it is both continual and reflective. So, and I should probably draw a chart for this, but all the curses during those 5, 7 times are applied again on Israel, but then they continue forward so that there is the seventh seven time when you read through Leviticus 26. So it's at this point in time that Yehovah hides his face from Israel. This parallels the curse of Numbers 5, where Yehovah applies the curse of bitter waters. It's a very bitter doctrine to see if Israel is faithful to Yehovah or if she has committed idolatry with other deities. So this is that time in Israel's history. This is where you find Deuteronomy 32, where Yahweh told Moses to rehearse a song for all of Israel, saying, in that day I will forsake this wicked generation. I will hide my face for them, and I will see what their end will be. And again, Genesis 9:5, the penalty of the Noahic covenant is applied as each man raises his hand against his brother. And this is where you find the horrific reign of terror of the Roman. It begins first with the Romans, and then it eventually develops into the Roman Catholic Church that really inherits this reign of terror and really annihilates a lot of people out of the earth in this judgment day, which really occurred for 2,000 years. So then we have, during the process of this diaspora, during the process of this reign of terror where Israel is continually persecuted, you find that something happens. Something almost magical happens during this horrific time in Israel's history. And that is for the descendants of Jacob. This law begins to be written on their hearts. We finally stop willingly bang our head against the brick wall and thinking that we can do what we have been doing over and over again and get new results. We realize that there are certain ways that simply do not work, while there are other ways that actually do work. And as we come to this understanding, this really becomes our inheritance. When Yehovah says, I am the inheritance of Jacob, this is what he's talking about. And these things that we have learned, the things that are revealed, they belong to us and our children forever. And all the words of the law that we may do them. Again, this signifies this writing of the law of Yehovah on our hearts and our minds. And look at where this is placed in Deuteronomy 29:29. This process of loving Yehovah, this occurs before the redemption. Because remember, Deuteronomy 28, Deuteronomy 29, and Deuteronomy 30 are all part of the same testimony. You can begin in Deuteronomy 28, and it is chronological the entire way through until you get to Deuteronomy 30, verse 14. So when you follow this chronology, you find that this love of the law really begins before an actual restoration. So the ninth point of the Yehovah's 10-point plan of salvation is that this third day of darkness is completed. This judgment of noonday, where this veil is cast over the eyes of all nations, this day where we grope around in darkness, where the book of Isaiah is given to one that is learned and said, read it, for I cannot understand it, where we lean on pastors, on teachers, and rabbis. This judgment of noonday is being lifted. The veil cast over the nations is removed, and each of us begin to read our scriptures, and we begin to understand what we read. We don't have to lean on someone else, because now we are given the tools. We were given the information and the knowledge to effectively read and understand the scriptures for ourselves without needing someone to go to the heavens above and get or do it for us. We can actually do that ourselves. Again, this is Zechariah's testimony of prophecy where he says, in that day, you will say, no more will every man teach his brother, but each man shall know me from the least to the greatest. So Deuteronomy 29:29 is really just the beginning. It's the early roots of this day of salvation where we come out of darkness and we return to Yehovah. But notice what this return to Yehovah, notice what it enables, and notice what it makes possible in the succeeding chronology. And remember, again, the testimony is totally chronological. You cannot take this day right here and superimpose it back on Deuteronomy 28 or Deuteronomy 15 or any other point in time in Israel's history. You really have to look at this in a linear, ongoing fashion. So now we come to the day of salvation, something that for you and I today, we have yet to see. We are on the precipice. We are right at the door, the threshold of this happening, but we're not quite there yet. This is what Yehovah says. You find in Deuteronomy 30:1-6, the latter day remnant returns to Yehovah. And the important key, we don't just return to him with our hearts, our minds, and our souls, but we actually obey. So we return to the covenant, we obey, and this remnant is delivered. We are redeemed out of diaspora. We return to the promised land. And you find that the diaspora and the promised land covenants are fulfilled. And Israel finally obeys Numbers' effacement judgment to chase out all those that do not love Yehovah's way or his law. They're not willing to live by his covenant. We drive those people out of the land so that Israel can finally have peace. Simply because you cannot have peace when there are people in your society that are not willing to follow your national constitution, that each and every time, no matter what nation it is, will always lead to fragmentation, civil war, and a lot of not just oppression, but a lot of disunity and violence within your homeland. So the key to peace and harmony is really the sanctifying of the covenant by all people who live in this specified territory. Now, I really encourage you, if you don't do it with any of the others, I'd say with the second epic where it talks about the heaven is brass and the earth is iron, compare those two texts during the second epic of 70 years, but also compare these two verses, the verses Deuteronomy 1-6 and Leviticus 26:44-45. They are just amazing. Yehovah talks about in Leviticus 26, even though for all this rebellion and even for all these curses and everything that has occurred to Israel, he says, yet for all this will I not forget the covenants that I have made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he says, I will yet again fulfill those and do my good, do good to the house of Israel. So it's very important that we realize these promises are eternal. They cannot be wished away. There is no one that can annul it. And even when Yehovah breaks covenant with Israel by taking them off the land, it's temporary. It is a temporary suspension because of Israel's rebellion. All Yehovah is doing is he is applying the already stipulated breach of contract that is in that law or in the testimony. He's applying it to Israel, and he's waiting. He is waiting for a new day when Israel has become a new creation, when Israel has become this man of refined gold who has this love of the law, this love of good, this love of justice and of judgment, and returns to him. And when that happens, it enables Yehovah to then sanctify Israel in the eyes of all nations and redeem them to the promised land. So then you have in Deuteronomy 30, verses 5-6, this idea of the double blessing. Yehovah pours the Spirit out upon the Israel. She becomes a blessing to all other nations. Remember, this fulfills the promise to Abraham in both Genesis 12 in the Promised Land Covenant, the Migration Covenant, as well as Genesis 15, where Yehovah states that through Israel's seed, through the nation of Israel, all nations of the earth will be blessed. You find that this fulfills the circumcision covenant, where Israel's heart is totally circumcised to Yehovah. The burnt offering covenant, which I go into, and I discuss the prophetic implications of that during the long day of Yehovah. That is fulfilled. It's in Israel's past. Notice all of this history, all the curses are in Israel's past. There is nothing more in Israel's future except blessing as long as, again, it's always predicated on if she will sanctify Yehovah, and if she will continue to walk in his way. Jeremiah says, then shall we know if we will go on to know Yehovah. And there's this indication that Yehovah has this extra blessing, this special blessing in his covenant when we finally get it right, and we're finally willing, that we cannot even comprehend. It goes beyond this double blessing and this era of world peace that Israel will initiate, that it will be inaugurated, and all nations will come to Israel. They will be the light of the nations, and people will come to seek how to live in a world without oppression, how to coexist and to thrive, how to get rid of all of the diseases. All those things we will learn from Yehovah, but Israel will be his priest, and they will teach the world. So these are some of the texts now that reiterate this. And this is what Deuteronomy says of this era. It says, and Yehovah your God will bring you to the land which your forefathers possessed. Again, Yehovah is bringing these descendants of Jacob scattered into all nations, specifically back to the promised land, to the very land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It says, and he will do your good, and he will multiply you above your fathers. Yehovah your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed, to love Yehovah with all your heart and all your soul, that you may live. So Ezekiel looks to the testimony. He looks to the testimony, and he knows what to prophesy for Israel's future. And this is how Ezekiel interprets Deuteronomy verses 5 through 6. He says, and I will sanctify my great name, which was profaned among the heathen, which you have profaned in the middle of them. And the heathen shall know that I am Yehovah, says Yehovah God, when I shall be sanctified in you before their eyes. For I will take you from among the heathen, and I will gather you out from all countries, and I will bring you into your own land. Then I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean. From all your filthiness and from all your idols will I cleanse you. A new heart will I give to you, and a new spirit will I put within you. And I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I will give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk in my statutes, to keep my judgments, and to do them. And you shall dwell in the land that I gave to your forefathers. Again, this is the specific land and territory of Israel, from the Euphrates River in the north, which includes modern-day Syria and Lebanon, all the way to the Sinai in the south, to the Pellucic branch of the Nile in Egypt, which has since silted up. It is this entire territory of land that is Israel's inheritance. It says, and you shall be my people, and I will be your God. I will save you from all your uncleanliness, and I will call for the corn, and I will increase it. I will lay no famine upon you, no curses. I will multiply the fruit of the tree and the increase of your field, that you shall receive no more reproach of famine among the heathen. Then shall you remember your own evil ways and your doing that were not good, and you will loathe yourselves in your own sight for your iniquities and your abominations. But notice this idea of coming back to Yehovah, this idea of returning to him, and this, when you look at the future, the only thing that Yehovah prophesies for Israel's future is this time of blessing, this prophecy that Balaam had given over 3,500 years ago when Israel first came out of Egypt. So now I want to transition real quick because we have the testimony, but I want to give you guys a real life handbook as to how to use it when you are reading anything in the Torah or the prophets. So these are the four most important points that I have discovered in regarding to using the testimony. So when you read a passage from Deuteronomy, it could be in Deuteronomy, but whether it's Deuteronomy, whether it's Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, it doesn't matter who the prophet is. First of all, determine whether the prophecy is positive or negative. Once you can have done that, look at the categories mentioned in Deuteronomy 28. What specific categories or what specific issues does it address? Is it a prophecy against the land? Does it depict captivity, invasion, deportation? Does it predict illness and disease? Once you can determine what is exactly being prophesied, then go look at the testimony. look at where that particular curse is mentioned in Deuteronomy. And I say Deuteronomy because it gives much greater detail to the chronological prophecy than what Leviticus does. So see what Deuteronomy says, compare it, and you will know exactly the time period that that particular prophet is speaking of. Remember, Isaiah says, seal up the law, or seal up the testimony within my prophets. So that's the idea that people forget how to use the testimony. So if we're going to remove the veil that is cast over the eyes of all nations today, if we are going to come out of this day of judgment where this darkness went down at noonday, we have got to learn how to use the testimony once more. So then when we look at it, if we determine that a prophecy is positive, well, we have to look at where the law gives positive prophecies. And you find that it gave positive prophecies very early in Israel's future, both during the time of David, Samuel, and Solomon. For the Second Temple period, it was that first 70 years that Zechariah, Haggai, when they give these positive prophecies about the remnant on the promised land. But again, it's that first 70 years. After that, you find that there's nothing but curses that are laid out for the nation. But beginning in Deuteronomy 29:22, you find is the chronological point where it talks about our generation today. And maybe back one or two generations before us. But it's still this idea that we are coming out of darkness, we are turning to live rightly. And once, if you will apply these four principles to your study of scripture, to your study of prophecy, you will be in a much better place to understand scripture, to understand prophecy, to understand it, to apply it, to know what a particular prophet is talking of. You won't just be out in left field and going, well, this sounds really good. This sounds, it makes sense, but not knowing exactly when a prophet is referring to. For instance, anytime a prophet refers to in that day, the day of Yehovah, a man taking hold of his brother, in order to kill him, or it talks about brother raising against brother. Every single one of those passages in Isaiah, but Zechariah, Haggai, all of those verses, Zephaniah, they refer to the day of Yehovah, which is long in our past. I mean, that prophecy has been fulfilled a long time ago. And now when you look to the testimony, when you look to what is decreed, and it is a decree for Israel's future, it is blessing. It is hope. It is a time of salvation. But Yehovah has brought that about by the curses and the corrections and the punishment of our forefathers. So we have inherited that. So I am going to give a couple minutes for the video to catch up because there is about a 45-second lag. And I'm going to see if you guys have any questions or comments. If you do, please feel free to put them on the Facebook comments section. Now, I will say that I have noticed that Facebook is not really good with displaying all the comments. So I'm going to give this about 2 minutes. And if I don't see any comments, I'm just going to go ahead and call it a day. And if you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and post them within the post on the Yahweh Exists page, so that I can come back and I'll respond to those as I can. So thank you guys so much for joining me. It is such a joy and a pleasure to be back with you. I have missed y'all, and I look forward to going through and completing our study of volume 1. And my hope is that as we complete volume 1, which I think will be at least August, perhaps October of 2018, that will probably take maybe a month off in the fall of next year from our book club. And then when we start back, guess what? We will start back with volume 2. And let me just say, the information in volume 2 will knock your socks off. It has totally knocked my socks off. I am absolutely in awe, and just the total joy that is predicted in the testimony. We can live, and we have so much to look forward to. There is not a time of nothing depressing in the future, just joy and salvation. So, okay. Well, thank you guys so much. I am going to go ahead and call it a day. So let's see if I can end this. Again, this is my first time using this technology. Let's see if I can end this class by hitting the right button. So thank you guys so much for joining me. Shavua Tov.